Welcome to the Codcast. I'm Shira Schoenberg. The Democratic primary for governor is now a two-woman race, pitting State Senator Sonia Chang-Diaz against Attorney General Maura Healey. Senator Chang-Diaz, thank you so much for joining me to talk about your campaign. But first, I'd love to hear more about your personal background. I know your dad was a NASA astronaut. I'd imagine that led to some pretty interesting childhood experiences.
It did. But when you're a kid, you just you don't realize that what your parents do, may or may not be unusual, right? So it's just your goofy dad. But he, now as an adult, I realize it's pretty extraordinary. And what he did was pretty dangerous. He actually holds the record, or he's tied for the record for the most number of space flights in NASA history. So yes, many times of being down at Cape Canaveral to watch the space shuttle launch. It's pretty heady stuff. And thinking about the his incredible, trajectory in life, and the way that he came to this country as a skinny brown kid with $50 in his pocket. But this monumental dream, right, of his childhood dream of becoming an astronaut, and how many hurdles he had to clear in order to do that. It puts the challenges that I face in perspective, and gives me no excuse, no quarter, right, for thinking small.
And I believe, am I right that you grew up in Newton? Did you live your entire life in Massachusetts? Take us through your history.
Not my entire life, right? So, so my parents divorced when I was very young, and so a couple years when we were, very little, lived actually out in Oregon, just where my mom had some family, so she had a little bit more help around the edges. And then, but she, really missed her community here in Massachusetts, so then moved us back when I was, I think, in first grade. And then when I was in high school, I lived for a time in Costa Rica with my dad's family. But yeah, the bulk of it has been here in Massachusetts.
And you went into teaching. Where did you teach, and how did that experience affect your views on education, which I know is something that you've made a centerpiece of your career until today?
Yeah, so it is was a deeply sort of imprinting experience for me that deeply informs my work as a policymaker. But I want to just back up before the time in the classroom, Shira, and I got to give propers here. Folks love to talk about my dad, and his story is incredible, but my mom, who's a social worker, and her experience and her story has had an equally important imprint on me. And so I just, want to sort of do that honor because growing up the child of a social worker is a deeply politicizing experience. And it's actually a huge part of why I went into community organizing and public policy, because you see your mom, in my case, working with families and particularly women and children who live on the margins, and see the barriers and the obstacles that they hit up against over and over and over again. And it really set me to thinking, there's got to be a more systemic way to solve a lot of these problems that her clients are facing over and over again. And that actually was a huge part of what pushed me into teaching, right? And what I saw, where I taught, was the Lynn Public Schools. And I saw there, very starkly the way that the wealth divide and, the gap between have and have not communities, looking at the experience of my 8th graders in Lynn, and, the difference between what they got, in Lynn versus what I got in the Newton Public Schools growing up, because my mom had really sort of cobbled together, what resources and what privilege she did have in order to move us there. Because she knew I would get a phenomenal education in the Newton Public Schools. And I saw the difference, right, between those two worlds. And the way that gap narrowed the life choices for my kids in Lynn. And that really made me mad, as you could imagine. And it pushed me back into organizing in order to, try to accomplish the changes that I thought would bring about systemic change for my students, right? So the things that I couldn't address from the classroom, the fact that kids would be coming to school in the dead of winter without winter coats, and there was never enough paper in the supply closet, at the school that I taught at. And, just how, there were just, the resources were spread too thin to serve students right. And so I got out there and I organized for, voting rights and for more women in office and for progressive policy, because, these are the things that I really saw as barriers to their needs being met. And when change still was not happening, I decided to run myself and put my name on a ballot. And in 2008, to the surprise of a lot of naysayers, I won. And, I became the first Latina and the first Asian American to serve in the state Senate. And the rest, is history. You've witnessed some of that. But that's sort of the connection between my teaching experience and then what brought me into MA Poli, as we say. And, what I saw in the classroom over those years has really deeply informed my perspective as a policymaker. On the education committee, for many years as the chair of the education committee, and even outside the confines of the education committee, because so many of the things that we as a state sort of drop at the schoolhouse door, those problems don't start inside the school, right? This housing crisis that we face, or the yawning wealth divide between communities of color and white Bay Staters is, those are problems that schools don't cause and can't solve by themselves. So we have to address those problems outside of the education committee as well. But that's what really was the seed of my push for major overhaul to our K-12 funding system. That then became the Student Opportunity Act, was what I saw, and experienced directly my time in the classroom.
So why run for governor right now?
Well, look, it's not difficult to see it, right? When I look around, it's so clear that it is getting harder and harder for working families to live in our state, right? We've got housing prices that are going through the roof. We've got some of the worst traffic congestion in the nation, the fastest growing student debt load, childcare costs, healthcare costs are going up and up. And then we've got the consequences of climate change that are not just around the corner, but they're here, right? We've got already just, in the past year or two, record rainfall, record heat in Massachusetts. We've got some of the highest concentrations of affordable housing in flood zones here in Boston. So, working families are going to get in it from every side and are just carrying this enormous load, from all of these different systems. And I've seen over my 13 years in office in the Senate that much more often than not on Beacon Hill, we just tell families to wait for solutions to those problems. And people ain't got time to wait. And I know that the governor's office is a huge lever for injecting more urgency into our work on Beacon Hill. And that is why I'm running.
And you've talked about Governor Baker not acting urgently enough on issues, whether education or climate change or a host of other issues. But when you look at some of the polling that's out there, Governor Baker has been extraordinarily popular. And if you just look back historically, voters have generally wanted a governor who's more middle of the road. That's how we've gotten a lot of moderate Republicans in office. You've been carving out a niche as a progressive Democrat. Why do you think that's what voters want?
Well, listen, I think actually what voters want is not necessarily somebody who's middle of the road, but somebody who is going to keep them as their North Star, right? That is going to be anchored in the needs and the fears and the aspirations and hopes of working families in the state. And someone who's willing to be independent minded, right? And not just do the go along to get along. And folks are fairly cynical about Beacon Hill, and I think some of that cynicism is earned. And so, voting for a governor who is going to be independent minded, relative to the powers that be on Beacon Hill, I think is what voters are really hungry for, and that is what I've got a 13-year record, Shira, of doing, right, and not just saying, right, but actually walking the walk and coming off of the sidelines in order to, when necessary, challenge leaders in either party or both parties in order to drive change. And I also, have worked with leaders in both parties in order to accomplish change. And the Student Opportunity Act was an example of both of those things. And then, not just be willing to sort of disagree, right, but then build the deep and wide coalition that can put change in the end zone so that we're actually accomplishing some change in people's lives in the real world. And, that is ultimately, I think, what voters are looking for in a governor. And, Charlie Baker, I think, has been a beneficiary over the last several years of that desire for some sanity and some independence relative to the National Republican Party. But not voting for Donald Trump has not fixed our traffic congestion problems here in Massachusetts, right? And it hasn't made the crushing student debt load that young people are carrying go away. It hasn't made childcare more affordable in our state. And those are the problems that the next governor is going to need to carry and focus on and, relentlessly drive towards solutions on.
And you mentioned your work on the Student Opportunity Act, which is the landmark school funding overhaul. But I actually am remembering back to one interview I did with you. It was in your office after midnight on July 31st, 2018.
Oh, you're getting out the historical record here.
Yep, last day of formal sessions, and you had just failed to reach an agreement with the lead House negotiator on the big education funding bill. And that was the bill that would become, it was a precursor to the Student Opportunity Act. And the SOA did pass the next session. You worked on it, but you weren't the committee chair anymore. And that kind of, I think, raised the question for some people of, are you able to negotiate and compromise in a way that will be necessary if you're the governor trying to work with legislators on Beacon Hill to get things done?
Yes, the answer is undoubtedly yes. But here's the thing, Shira, and this again gets back to the issue of being, we need a governor and we need leaders on Beacon Hill who are anchored in their commitment to working families. And, I was literally, you said it, right? It was like midnight when we had that interview, right? I stayed at the negotiating table until, like 11:59 and 59 seconds in order to, I wasn't going to walk away, right? And that will continue to be my methodology, right? I am here to rock with anybody who wants to get work done on behalf of working families in Massachusetts. And we had bipartisan sponsorship on the Promise Act and on its precursor legislation. It really crossed the aisle. But ultimately, it's not about, I could have agreed to things in that conference committee that would have gotten the bill out, but they wouldn't have been things that actually solved the problem, right? We have nation-leading opportunity and achievement gaps in Massachusetts. And we have school districts of every shape and size, right? Rural, urban, suburban, small districts, large districts that have been, carrying the load on their own in many ways for a generation, right? For a quarter century since we first put our school funding system in place in 1993, because the state was progressively walking away from its share of that partnership. And, so we could have gotten a bill done in 2018 if I had been willing to agree to something that was just a Band-Aid, right? And it would have been nice to be able to come out and celebrate a political victory and pat myself on the back and put out a press release, but it wouldn't have actually solved the problem, right? And so, yeah, sometimes you got to be willing to stand up and say, nope, this is not it, right? This does not solve the problem, and I'm not going to be dishonest with the people of Massachusetts about what this actually is. And so, there's a line below which I was not willing to go. And what I said was, we're going to come back again stronger, right? We're going to build a bigger, badder coalition, right? And bad, by bad, I mean in the Michael Jackson kind of a way. Coalition that is going to put the real win, right? The win that's actually going to solve the problem into the end zone. And that's exactly what we did, right? We went out and we built a deeper and wider coalition that made it impossible for Beacon Hill to say no to the needs of working families and low-income children. And instead of agreeing to something that was about $300 million worth of funding for schools, in the end, we got a package that was $1.5 billion with a B, that was actually right-sized to solve the problem, right, of closing those opportunity and achievement gaps. And that difference of $1 billion or more was specifically targeted to low-income districts, right, districts of highest need. And I'm proud now, sure, when I go out across the state, over the past 7 or 8 months, I'm on the campaign trail, I've had the opportunity to, just come into contact with some school principals and superintendents and school district leaders. And I say, the first SOA dollars are starting to hit the streets. Like, what are you spending your first SOA dollars on? And almost all of them have told me what they've chosen to spend their first dollars on is social emotional wraparound services for students, right? So there's kids out there today that have access to a school social worker or psychologist that didn't last year.
Mhm.
And that's real change that families in Massachusetts can feel in their real lives. And we would not have gotten that if I'd just gone for the political win, but not actually solving the problem.
And in your campaign, you've laid out some pretty ambitious plans. But I'm curious, practically, are these things that you can actually achieve if you do win? I mean, just for example, you've talked about establishing a carbon-free electric grid by 2030. How do you do that without massively raising electricity prices? Is that practical?
Yeah, it's a great question. And don't let me off the hook. I'm going to answer that question, but I want to just come back and, to your previous question, get back to the root of it, which was, can I make a deal, right? And the other example that I will put up for you is the police accountability law from 2020, right? Very, the tough negotiation. I was one of the architects of the Senate bill. It's a bill that I'm extraordinarily proud of. It did a whole host of things, ban chokeholds, curtail the use of no-knock warrants, create an affirmative duty to intervene, and reform qualified immunity in our state in Massachusetts. We were in a very, intense conference committee negotiation on that bill for the next several months after we got the Senate bill passed. And in the end, we did not get everything that I wanted, right, in conference committee. We were not able to get to agreement between the House and the Senate on qualified immunity reform. That was hard to let go. That was a difficult decision that I circled up with advocates, in order to make in communion with them, not just on my, as a sort of, person up in the ivory tower or Beacon Hill who makes those decisions alone. And we're coming back and we're going to still, I filed the legislation. We're still fighting for qualified immunity reform. But, I said, look, the rest of this bill is hugely important progress. And let's take this win, right? And we now have in Massachusetts, we passed that bill, right? We didn't get nothing out of that conference committee. We passed that law. It is a nation-leading model. And we now have the only police oversight board statewide, at the state level in Massachusetts among the 50 states that is civilian controlled, among, many of the other reforms in that bill. So, there's examples of both ways. Sometimes you got to stand on the line and say, I'm not going below this line. And sometimes, yeah, you do have to take less than 100% in order to make huge progress forward. And I've shown over my time in office that I can do both.
And I think that does lend itself to the question that I asked you of, you have these ambitious plans, I'm thinking the energy one. I'll also throw out there universal affordable preschool and debt-free college. That's something that, the Mass Budget and Policy Center has estimated the cost for universal preschool is $5 billion itself. Are these plans of yours realistic? How do you pay for them?
With money, Shira, and look, I'm not trying to hide the ball on that. We put specific plans out there, and have done the homework on looking at financing options for them. Because the truth is, these are transformational changes that I'm talking about. To create a universal early education and care system in our state would be transformational for families. Take a huge bite out of income inequality in our state, and poverty and educational opportunities. It would deepen our bench in terms of the workforce that we can create here in Massachusetts, which we know is a huge barrier. It's a constant, frustration and complaint that I hear from business leaders is that they don't have the talent, that they're looking for. So it would be transformational in really positive ways. That's going to cost money. You can't get big transformational change in most cases without spending some money. We also, are one of the wealthiest states and one of the wealthiest nations in the world, Shira. And so we've gotten ourselves into this sort of scarcity mindset over the last, few decades. But then we have to look up, pick our heads up and look around and look at states like, Alabama, right, that the Boston Globe just told us is lapping us in terms of standing up early education and care systems that are approaching universal. And we have the resources to do this here in Massachusetts. We have to have frank conversations about progressive revenue reform, right? That's why I support the Fair Share Amendment, aka the millionaire's tax. It is why we need to do things like close corporate tax loopholes that make it easy for companies to, multinational companies to offshore their profits into, offshore tax havens. But we do have a pathway to fund these things in Massachusetts, and we got to get more ambitious about doing that.
So on the energy plan, for example, are you going about just raising energy prices?
No, look, we are in an incredible position here in GIR where we are in what some people call the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind here in Massachusetts, in terms of the natural resources that we are right next to with our coastline. Massachusetts could meet Massachusetts need, electricity needs with offshore wind alone. I think it's either 16 or 19 times over, right? And we shouldn't do it with offshore wind alone, right? We should have a more diversified portfolio, but the technology is there. The natural resources are there. We need to couple solar energy into our portfolio. We need to make investments into our grid to make sure that we have the storage capacity, right, to rely 100% on renewable energy for our electricity consumption. But the natural resources are there, the technology is there. We have to have the political will to make the transition. Are we going to have to do some things differently? Yes, we are. I do not know exactly what the next 7 years, 8 years are going to look like in terms of price fluctuations. None of us know that, right? Just looking at, for example, what's going on in Ukraine right now, right? We couldn't have predicted that 3 years ago, 5 years ago. It's going to have an effect on gas prices. So there are going to be a lot of variables in the market over the next decade. But what I do know for sure is that we are already paying for the consequences of unaddressed climate change. And that costs money too, right? When you see, record rainfall and record heat levels, climate, volatile weather events in Massachusetts, all of these things come with a pretty steep price tag. And right now, those costs are being externalized. Fossil fuel companies are externalizing those costs onto the general public, and most especially onto low-income people, communities of color, and immigrant communities who are bearing the brunt of climate change. We have to socialize those costs across all of society so that we are doing this work together to make the transition. And not for nothing, right? In terms of when we're talking about economics, Jira, making the transition to a green energy economy is not about just sort of, sucking up the costs of, making a transition to clean energy. But there are huge economic opportunities in front of us to grab, right? We can create literally tens of thousands of new jobs, good paying jobs, family sustaining jobs in Massachusetts by growing these industries here in Massachusetts, so that we're not, buying our energy from other states and other countries. So there's economic development opportunity here as well.
So before you can get to implementing any of these plans, you've got to get past Attorney General Healey in the primary. She's raised more money than you. Early polling shows her ahead of you, better name recognition. Why do you think you can win the primary?
So Shira, we have seen so many examples, time and time again, where people-powered movements have taken on and won against, establishment powers in Massachusetts. And I'm always surprised at how quickly we sort of forget the lessons, right, of those examples, where we have seen that, that kind of upset of the conventional wisdom happen. This race is going to be won on the ground. We have been building our organizing infrastructure for the past 8 months, right? I got into this race, not because I didn't get into it because I thought it was going to be easy. And none of the fights that I've taken on over the past 13 years have been easy ones. but they've been important ones, right? And won them time and time again. But I got into this race 8 months ago when, presumably Charlie Baker was going to be the incumbent that I was going to be challenging. And we have been building the organizing infrastructure across those 8 months, and we're hitting all of our internal marks, and that's the most important metric, right? We have just this past month, over 50% of our donors to the campaign were first-time donors, right? So we are primed for growth. We've built a coalition of over 70 state and local elected official endorsers across this state. We got the endorsement last week of Progressive Massachusetts. We had the early endorsement of Neighbor to Neighbor Massachusetts. Together they represent thousands and thousands of members across this state. So we are showing up, we're campaigning. I am really, I'm thrilled, frankly, by the enthusiasm that we're seeing out there on the campaign trail, both over the last several months and most recently at the caucuses. And at the end of the day, this race is going to be won on the ground. And that's why we are focusing on building that organizing infrastructure. In the end, we have to remember, and again, we've seen this time and time again in Massachusetts, that it's not money that wins elections, it's people that win elections.
And you can learn more on commonwealthmagazine.org. Senator Sonia Chang-Diaz, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks, Sharon.